The auctioneer's gavel cracked against the podium, but all I could feel was justice served cold. My daughter Nicole sat frozen in her car across the street, watching strangers bid on the house she had lost through greed and pyramid schemes. Her husband Derek stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the courthouse steps where his entire life was being sold. Sold to the LLC represented by Whitfield Capital Partners, the auctioneer announced loudly. The crowd of investors dispersed, leaving Nicole and Derek alone with their devastation and mounting panic. 24 hours later, they knocked on my tiny house door. Homeless, broke, desperate, begging for help from the father they had tried to throw away like garbage. I stepped onto my porch and made one phone call. A woman in a business suit arrived with a folder of legal documents. "I'd like to introduce you to the owner of that LLC," I said quietly, watching Nicole's face. "It's me." Her expression shifted from confusion to horror to grudging respect in 3 seconds. I had used my retirement savings to buy her foreclosed house for pennies on the dollar. I owned everything now: the land, the main house, the tiny house on the lawn. "You can stay," I told her, tossing her the keys to the tiny house. "And don't worry about the dust. Subscribe right now and hit that notification bell, because this is how a father taught his daughter the most expensive lesson of her life." But let me take you back to where this whole story began, 6 months before that auction on the courthouse steps. I was sanding a rocking chair in my workshop when my daughter Nicole stormed through the garage door coughing theatrically, like she had walked into a burning chemical factory. The industrial air filtration system I had spent $4,000 installing hummed quietly in the corner, keeping the air cleaner than most hospital operating rooms. But Nicole clutched her throat and gasped for breath like she was dying right there on the concrete floor. She delivered her ultimatum without ever looking me directly in the eye. The dust was a health hazard, she claimed. I had 30 days to clear out my tools and move into a retirement community they had already selected without asking my opinion. The words felt rehearsed, practiced in front of a mirror until they sounded almost natural. I had spent 40 years building custom cabinets to pay for her college education and the down payment on this very house. I agreed to leave the house, but I dropped a cryptic comment that made her pause mid-performance. "I'll be closer than you think, sweetheart." While packing my belongings into cardboard boxes that weekend, I remembered something important about this property that Nicole had clearly forgotten. I had helped her and Derek purchase this land back in 1998, contributing the entire down payment from my construction business savings account. I dug through my files until I found the original property survey and deed. Documents I had kept copies of for exactly this kind of situation. My eyes landed on a clause I had almost forgotten existed after all these years. A historic easement exempted temporary structures under 400 square feet from HOA approval if occupied by a family member of the property owner. The exemption dated back decades when this neighborhood was farmland and workers needed seasonal housing during harvest time. I read the clause 5 times to make absolutely sure I understood it correctly. I was not angry anymore. I was completely strategic. I pulled out my old drafting paper and began sketching blueprints for a Victorian-style tiny house that would measure exactly 399 square feet. Then I ordered $15,000 worth of premium lumber from my favorite supplier. Nicole and Derek announced they were leaving for a weekend digital detox at some expensive mountain resort without cell phone reception. The moment their luxury SUV disappeared, around the corner, I picked up my phone and called my old construction crew. These were men I had worked alongside for decades, men who owed me favors I had never collected on until this perfect moment. They arrived Saturday morning with trucks full of equipment and enormous grins spreading across their weathered faces. We did not build a simple storage shed or a basic garden structure. We framed a fully functional Victorian-style tiny house right in the exact center of Nicole's award-winning zoysia grass lawn. The lawn that had won neighborhood beautification awards 3 years running was now the foundation for my new home. The speed of our construction was terrifyingly efficient because we had built hundreds of structures together over our long careers. By Sunday evening, the entire frame stood complete, with walls, roof, windows, and a charming wraparound front porch. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalk, taking photographs with their phones and whispering among themselves in disbelief. Their car pulled into the driveway Sunday night just as the sun was setting behind my beautiful new home. Nicole stepped out first, and her scream echoed through the quiet neighborhood like a fire alarm shattering the evening peace. She ran across the lawn in her designer heels, which sank into the grass with every frantic step, demanding to know what I had done to her precious property. Derek stood frozen by the car, with his mouth hanging open in complete disbelief at the structure before him. I climbed down from my porch and calmly handed Nicole a laminated copy of the historic easement clause along with the relevant sections of the city zoning code, specifically Section 8, Paragraph 4. I explained that she had complained about the garage being too dusty for her delicate lungs to handle. This tiny house was completely outdoors, where fresh air circulated freely around the clock. Problem solved. I told her I would be moving in immediately, since she had given me 30 days, notice to vacate the main house. She crumpled the laminated paper in her fist. I had made 17 copies. Nicole called the police the very next morning, reporting me for trespassing and illegal construction on her private property. 2 officers arrived with notepads ready, clearly expecting to cite an elderly man for building a structure without proper permission. I invited them onto my charming porch and offered them fresh coffee from my new French press that I had unpacked that morning. Then I showed them the building permit I had quietly pulled from the city planning office 3 weeks before groundbreaking ever started. Everything was completely legal, professionally inspected, and officially approved by every relevant authority. The sergeant studied my paperwork carefully, with growing amusement spreading across his face. Then he looked at my face more closely, and recognition dawned. He remembered me. I had built his kitchen cabinets 10 years ago, and his wife still talked about how beautiful they were to everyone she met. The officers left laughing and shaking my hand warmly, complimenting the excellent craftsmanship of my tiny Victorian house. Nicole stood in her doorway, watching the whole interaction turn against her. Derek decided to take matters into his own hands the following week after the police visit failed. I woke up one morning to discover he had cut the extension cord running from the main house to my tiny home during the night. The refrigerator was warm, the lights were completely dead, and he stood at his kitchen window smirking at me through the glass like he had won some great victory. It was petty and childish, exactly what I had come to expect from my son-in-law over the years. But I had anticipated this exact move weeks before he ever thought of it. I walked around to the back of my tiny house and unveiled the solar panel array I had installed on the roof during construction. I had specifically chosen industrial-looking panels that clashed horribly with Nicole's carefully curated neighborhood aesthetic. The ugly gray rectangles sat prominently visible from the street for everyone to see. I was now completely energy independent from the main house. That evening, I fired up my backup generator and ran my loudest table saw at exactly 7 in the morning. I walked around the property one quiet evening, genuinely curious about what was so incredibly important in the garage that I had to be forcibly removed from it. The windows were dusty, but I could see clearly enough through the grime to understand everything. The space was not being converted into a nursery for future grandchildren or a home gym like they had suggested during my eviction conversation. Instead, the entire garage was filled floor to ceiling with cardboard boxes stamped with a cosmetics company logo I did not recognize from any legitimate business. Nicole had joined one of those pyramid schemes that promised ordinary people they could become millionaires by selling overpriced makeup to their friends and family. The boxes contained thousands of dollars worth of cheap cosmetics that absolutely nobody was buying from her. The dust excuse had been a complete fabrication from the beginning. She needed my workshop space to store her failing business inventory, and I was simply in the way of her dreams. I counted at least 200 boxes through the dirty window. The HOO president arrived on my lawn 3 days later with a clipboard clutched in her hands and an expression of righteous fury twisting her features. Her name was Barbara, and she had terrorized this neighborhood for 15 years with arbitrary rules about grass height and mailbox colors and holiday decoration timing. She threatened me with fines of $500 per day for my supposedly unauthorized structure, waving violation notices in my face like weapons of war. I let her finish her entire rehearsed speech without interruption. Then I invited her to sit on my porch for a civil conversation. I explained that according to the HOA bylaws, she apparently had never read carefully enough. I was technically the senior resident of this particular property. My name remained on the original land trust that had been established when Nicole purchased the house with my substantial financial help. I had certain rights that superseded the homeowner association rules completely. Then I mentioned casually that I was considering auditing the HOA financial records. Barbara retreated quickly. Nicole escalated her campaign against me the following week by shutting off the external water spigot that supplied my tiny house with running water. I could not shower properly, wash dishes, or flush my composting toilet the way it was designed to function. She stood at her window watching me discover the problem, clearly expecting me to surrender my dignity and beg for access to the main house bathroom like a desperate old man. Instead, I picked up my phone and called the city housing department and filed a formal complaint against my own daughter. It turned out that shutting off water to a legal tenant, which I technically was according to my official occupancy permit, violated the State Habitability Act quite seriously. An inspector arrived within 48 hours and confirmed the violation with extensive documentation. The city fined Nicole $2,000, ordered her to restore my water immediately without further delay, and awarded me damages for the inconvenience she had caused. I used the money to install a beautiful copper rain collection system on my roof. I noticed a strange black sedan parked on the street one quiet afternoon, with a man in an expensive suit sitting inside taking photographs of the main house through his window. He had been there for over an hour, making notes on a clipboard and occasionally speaking into his phone. I walked over casually and knocked on his window, startling him badly enough that he dropped his pen. He rolled down the window and looked at me with obvious confusion, clearly assuming I was the hired gardener based on my work clothes and the sawdust covering my boots and shirt. He told me it was a real shame about the shack sitting on the front lawn, because the owners had personally assured him it would be removed before the closing date on the sale. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Nicole and Derek were not just storing unsold cosmetics in my old garage workshop. They were trying to sell the entire house completely behind my back without telling me anything. I woke up at 2 a.m. to a horrible smell seeping up through my tiny house floor. Sewage, or raw, unmistakable sewage, filling my nostrils and making my eyes water. I traced the problem to my composting toilet system, which had been functioning perfectly until that exact night without any issues. Someone had deliberately blocked the line to make my living situation unbearable. I hired a plumber first thing the next morning, a skilled man named Carlos, who had worked with me on dozens of construction projects over our long careers together. While Carlos dug around my tiny house foundation, searching for the deliberate blockage, his shovel hit something unexpected in the dirt. He called me over with a very serious expression on his weathered face. The main house septic tank had been illegally bypassed directly into the city storm drain, a felony environmental violation that could result in massive fines and criminal charges against the homeowner. Derek had done the modification himself years ago to save money on proper septic maintenance costs. Nicole decided to host a high-end dinner party to impress potential investors for her cosmetics pyramid scheme business. She sent elegant invitations to wealthy neighbors and important business contacts, promising an evening of sophisticated networking and exclusive product demonstrations in her beautiful home. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday night, with guests arriving at 7 o'clock in their finest formal attire. I decided that Saturday night would be absolutely perfect for some long-overdue woodworking projects on my front porch. I set up my lathe and began turning table legs at exactly 7:15, right outside their dining room window where every guest could see and hear me working. I positioned my brightest work lights to illuminate my porch like a stadium at night, spilling harsh light directly into their elegant dinner party atmosphere. Every time a guest looked toward the window with annoyance, I smiled broadly and waved cheerfully, with sawdust covering my happy face. The investors left before dessert was served. My mail still arrived at the main house address despite my obvious change of residence location. Nicole usually threw my letters on my tiny house porch without bothering to look at them closely. But one Tuesday afternoon, she accidentally handed me an envelope that was clearly meant for her eyes only and not mine. The return address was from their mortgage company, marked urgent in red letters. I opened it that night in my tiny house, deeply curious about why the bank was sending such desperate correspondence to my daughter. The letter was a foreclosure warning written in stark legal language. Nicole and Derek had not paid their mortgage in 6 full months without making any arrangements. They were 3 payments behind, with penalties accumulating rapidly, and the bank was officially initiating legal proceedings to seize the property and auction it. They had been spending the mortgage money on the pyramid scheme inventory and luxury vacations, probably assuming I would die soon and leave them my savings to cover their mounting debts. The bank sent a professional appraiser to evaluate the property value before proceeding with their foreclosure paperwork and auction preparations. A nervous young man with a clipboard arrived on a Thursday morning, clearly unsure what to make of the Victorian tiny house sitting so prominently on the manicured front lawn. I invited him warmly inside for a complete tour of my craftsmanship, showing him the work that had consumed 3 weeks of my retirement. The mahogany floors I had hand-cut and finished to a mirror shine. The custom joinery connecting every beam and joist with precision. The built-in furniture maximizing every inch of the compact space beautifully. He took photographs and careful measurements with growing professional appreciation for my skills. His final assessment valued my tiny house at $80,000, which actually increased the overall property value quite significantly. This complicated the bank's ability to sell the property as a distressed asset. A teenager from down the street was filming content for his social media account one afternoon when he noticed me carving a wooden bear sculpture on my front porch in the sunshine. He asked politely if he could record me working, and I agreed without thinking much about it at the time. 3 days later, his video had accumulated over 4 million views on the internet. People started driving from neighboring towns just to see the lawn grandpa in his charming tiny Victorian house in person. Local news stations sent camera crews to interview me about my unusual living situation and family conflict. I told my story simply and honestly, explaining how my own daughter had evicted me from the garage I had helped pay for decades ago. Nicole tried desperately to present herself as the victim on camera, claiming I was a difficult elderly man who stubbornly refused to accept necessary help. But the reporter clearly preferred my version of events and treated me sympathetically. Nicole appeared at my tiny house door 2 weeks after the news coverage had spread everywhere, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She sat on my porch and offered me what she called a truce between us. If I agreed to move into the retirement community they had originally selected for me, she would give me $10,000 in cash as compensation for my trouble. It was an insulting offer, considering I had given her well over $200,000 throughout her entire life for education, housing, and countless other needs she could never have afforded alone. I looked at my daughter carefully and told her calmly that I knew about the foreclosure notices. I knew about the pyramid scheme boxes filling my former workshop. I knew about the secret plan to sell the house without ever telling me. Her face went pale as paper as she realized the full extent of my knowledge. Nicole filed for a restraining order against me the following Monday morning, claiming I was menacing her with dangerous power tools and creating an unsafe living environment through my constant construction noise at all hours. Her expensive lawyer presented the case to a judge who looked increasingly skeptical as Nicole dramatically described her terrible fears and anxieties. The judge pointed out several obvious problems with her claims. We lived on the same property legally. I had every legal right to occupy my permitted structure. I had no history of violence or threatening behavior in my entire 73 years on this earth. He threw out the restraining order immediately and firmly scolded Nicole for wasting the court's valuable time with such frivolous and vindictive litigation against her own elderly father. He also noted that attempting to misuse the legal system against family members could have serious consequences if she continued down this path. I called my attorney that evening to discuss options for protecting myself legally from any future attacks. We reviewed the family trust I had established many years ago when my wife Martha was still alive, the trust that held my savings and investments for eventual inheritance to my descendants. Reading carefully through the old documents, my lawyer discovered a clause I had honestly forgotten about after all this time. The property could not be sold without the written consent of the grantor, meaning me specifically, as long as the grantor resided anywhere on the premises of the property. By living in my tiny house on the front lawn, I had accidentally activated a provision that made any sale of the main house completely impossible without my explicit written agreement. I was an anchor that could not be legally removed through any court proceeding or financial maneuver. Nicole and Derek were trapped with a property they could not afford to keep and could not sell. A small fire started near my tiny house at 2 a.m, waking me suddenly with the acrid smell of smoke and gasoline burning nearby. I grabbed my fire extinguisher and rushed outside in my pajamas, putting out the flames before they could spread to my wooden walls and destroy everything I had built. The burned area on the grass was clearly deliberate arson, with an accelerant splashed across the lawn in a trail leading directly to my porch. I checked my security camera footage carefully, expecting to see Nicole or Derek on the recording committing the crime. Instead, I saw a complete stranger, a large, intimidating man dressed in dark clothes who had arrived in an unmarked white van. I researched the cosmetics company Nicole had joined and discovered they used aggressive collection tactics against distributors who failed to pay for their inventory orders. The fire was a message from professional debt collectors. My daughter was in much deeper trouble than I had ever imagined. The competency hearing was Nicole's most desperate and cruel move yet against her own father. She filed official paperwork with the court to have me declared mentally incompetent, arguing that my decision to live in a tiny house on her front lawn proved beyond doubt that I was suffering from dementia and could not care for myself. Her lawyer presented my unusual living situation as clear evidence of severe cognitive decline requiring immediate intervention. The judge allowed me to respond to these serious allegations. I presented the detailed architectural drawings I had created for my tiny house, precise to the quarter inch in every measurement. I showed my comprehensive financial records demonstrating careful management of my substantial retirement savings over many years. I explained the extensive legal research I had conducted regarding zoning laws and property rights. The judge ruled I was not only competent, but demonstrated superior reasoning abilities. Derek approached my tiny house secretly one evening after dark, waiting carefully until Nicole had driven away on errands before making his move. He knocked on my door with a nervous expression and asked if we could talk privately, man to man. I invited him onto my porch with a friendly gesture. He offered to testify against Nicole in any legal proceedings in exchange for a portion of my eventual inheritance after I died. He blamed his wife entirely for all their financial problems, claiming she had controlled every penny and made all the terrible decisions that had ruined them. He spoke about his own wife with obvious contempt and cruelty that shocked me. I listened without any visible expression, while my phone quietly recorded every single word he spoke from my shirt pocket. I realized my daughter was not just greedy and selfish. She had married a snake who was actively working to destroy her. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the 15th of the following month at the county courthouse steps. Nicole believed desperately she still had time to find a private buyer who would pay off the substantial debt and let them walk away with something. She was completely wrong about the timeline. The bank moved faster than she had anticipated, and suddenly she was packing boxes instead of showing the house to potential purchasers. She planned to flee the state, entirely abandoning the debt and the property and me without looking back. On the morning she was loading suitcases into her car, I walked across the lawn and played her the recording of Derek's betrayal. She listened to her own husband offering to testify against her in court, blaming her for everything wrong in their lives, scheming to steal from both of us. Her face went through several emotions before settling on complete devastation. The action happened on a bright Tuesday morning with a small crowd of investors and professional property flippers gathered on the courthouse steps waiting eagerly. Nicole and Derek sat in their car across the street, watching helplessly as strangers bid on the home they had lost through their own greed and terrible decisions. The bidding was competitive, but mercifully brief. A mysterious limited liability company won with a cash offer significantly below market value, but sufficient to satisfy the bank's legal requirements. Nicole and Derek were served with a 24-hour eviction notice by the new owner's legal representatives before they could even drive away from the courthouse parking lot. They were panicked, suddenly homeless, and completely broke with nowhere to go. That evening, they knocked on my tiny house door, begging desperately for help. I stepped out onto my porch and asked them to wait patiently. I made one phone call while they stood shivering in the evening darkness, and a few minutes later, a professional-looking car pulled up to the curb. A woman in an expensive business suit emerged carrying a folder of legal documents. I introduced Nicole and Derek to the legal representative of the LLC that now officially owned their former home. Then I explained that I was the sole owner of that mysterious LLC. I had used my retirement savings and decades of investment returns to purchase the foreclosed property from the bank for pennies on the dollar. I owned the land completely. I owned the main house entirely. I owned the tiny house sitting on the lawn. I was now officially their landlord. Nicole stared at me with an expression caught between horror and grudging respect. I moved back into the main house the following week, reclaiming my beloved workshop in the garage that had started this entire conflict between us. I cleared out every single box of unsold cosmetics and donated them all to a women's shelter across town. I set up my woodworking tools exactly how I wanted them arranged. I built a new rocking chair to replace the one I never had the chance to finish before being evicted. Nicole could stay on the property, I decided, but definitely not in the main house where she had lived for so many ungrateful years. I tossed her the keys to the tiny house she had tried so desperately hard to destroy. "It's cozy," I told her with a slight smile. "And don't worry about the dust. The air out there is perfectly clean." I sat on my front porch that peaceful evening, drinking hot coffee, watching my Daughter struggled to fit her vanity table through the tiny front door.